Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2023. This is the latest year of a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads, where he assembles a valiant bridge crew of BookTubers to talk about Star Trek books, all summer long. In this case, we're doing June, July, and August, and we're not setting any strictures other than that. You read Star Trek, you have participated in BookTrek. So you have the whole summer to do it. I've been doing quite a bit. I've been reading quite a bit of Star Trek stuff because I associate Star Trek with summer. I think a lot of people do for one reason or another. I've been trying with BookTrek to strike out to new territory. It's always a besetting temptation when reading Star Trek for me to go back to books that I've read 2 times, 3 times, in some cases 24 times or 36 times, and I don't see so much worth in that. So I've been sort of poking around at other Star Trek. And I found the weak spot here, for me, would be Next Generation stuff. Star Trek The Next Generation was always my least favorite Star Trek, up until Kurtzman Trek. It was my least favorite of the real Star Treks. I thought it was boring, and on this channel many times for years, if you see it come up on my channel, you will hear me refer to it as Star Trek The Boring Generation. I needed to be gently pulled out of that opinion. BookTrek was in large part responsible for that. I rewatched the movies, some of which I consider to be real cut glass well done. I rewatched the whole of the original show, and I watched Star Trek Picard. The first season, the second season, with a, and then the third season of Star Trek Picard, which is pure poetry. And if there are cynics, there aren't any cynics watching me right now, but if there are cynics out there in the broader YouTube world that will say, well, you only think it's quote-unquote pure poetry because it was pure fan service. It wasn't pure fan service, but there was a lot of acknowledging that the fans are what made the show worth making, which is not bad. that is not a bad thing to do. Just because Season 1 and Season 2 of Picard hated the fans doesn't mean hating the fans is the right thing to do. Watch Season 3 of Star Trek Picard and tell me if you don't love it. Again, as with all of my critical judgments, I leave it up to you. Watch it and see if you don't love it. If you're a Next Generation fan, you're going to love it to pieces. You're going to love the daylights out of it. And that is technically New Trek, but it's tough to notice that it's New Trek when it's the old bridge crew of the Enterprise D altogether. There are little gestures in Star Trek Picard here and there. A character named Raffi is suddenly a world-class ninja, armed combat whirling dervish, which was a weird thing to put in there. It's not any part of the character. It isn't believable in any way. And it was echoed in Star Trek Strange New Worlds in a recent episode, where Dr. Mabenga and Nurse Christine Chapel take on an entire platoon of armed and armored trained Klingon warriors and defeat them easily in unarmed combat. I don't understand why the people behind New Trek are doing this, why they're doing this, why suddenly the good guys have to be good at everything. That is such a signature move of 21st century entertainment, that the good guy has to be good at everything, has to be great at everything, nonchalantly great at everything. The only reason that Michael Burnham is not running engineering is because she's too busy running every other thing on the ship. She is a better engineer than the chief engineer. She's a better astronomer than the chief astronomer. She's a better captain, of course, than any captain, past, present, or yet to come. I get that as an attitude, but physical combat, it's really weird. But that was just one tiny little note of New Trek in what was otherwise a fantastic show. Great writing, great performances all around. Just loved it. And the combination of all of those things has sort of reclaimed The Next Generation for me, to the extent that I have been going back to a lot of the novels that I either read and hated, maybe even hate-read, or ignored completely. And I went back to a Next Generation novel this time around that I admit is grounded in the original series, or the original movies in this case. I've read John Vornholt's book, The Genesis Wave, Book 1. That lovely cover showing us the Genesis effect from the Genesis device from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Star Trek fans will know the image there very much. You won't recognize really a starship running from that effect, but this was a device that was introduced in Star Trek II that really kicked off the Star Trek movie phenomenon. Nobody really knew what to do with Star Trek the motion picture, and it made money, but it didn't make any fans. And it didn't really rev up the fans who were already there. It left them with lots of existential questions of just the type that Gene Roddenberry loved, but not much in the way of an entertainment franchise basis. Then Star Trek II came along and everything changed. Then everything changed. People watched Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, in the movie theaters, and suddenly remembered that Star Trek can be really, really good in addition to being theoretically interesting. They were reminded of that with Star Trek II. And in Star Trek II, we get a lot of retconning. We get a lot of stuff that we'd never heard of before, which doesn't particularly happen in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Maybe that you would say Star Trek the Motion Picture didn't have that as its remit. But in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, we get introduced to Dr. Carol Marcus, who is I don't even know what you'd call her, planetary scientist of some kind or other, planetary ecologist of some kind or other, and also a former lover of Jim Kirk's. And the mother of his son, David Marcus, is 18 or 19. I think he's supposed to be 18 or 19 in The Wrath of Khan. Played by a tragic figure named Merrick Bartrick. But that name always throws me off. Oh, right. We learn in that episode that Kirk had a son, that he has a son. That is a weird thing to suddenly be shoehorning into the continuity, and the way the movie gets around it, and the movie does it in a really good way, as opposed to the way it would do it in 2023, which is to say, yeah, it's always been true, didn't you know? I guess you weren't really a fan. in the movie, Kirk doesn't know. He doesn't know. He knows that he has a son, but he doesn't know anything about the boy's grown-up years. He has no idea who he's seeing when he beats his son up in a fight, and he grouses about it himself. He's feeling old in this movie. I almost said episode, and he says, a madman I haven't seen in 15 years wants to kill me. You show me a son who'd be happy to help him. We get all of those continuity reboots, and we also get an unbelievably tragic ending. And we get Ricardo Montalban reprising his role as Khan Noonien Singh. You get all of that stuff, and so you might forget the MacGuffin at the middle of the movie, which is the Genesis device. Carol Marcus has developed a thing that, weirdly enough, considering that she's a pacifist scientist, she devises as in the shape of a torpedo that you fire at a planet, and it remakes the planet's biological matrix, is I think how it's put in the movie. Wipes out everything on the planet in favor of a new, stable biological matrix, a living planet. So you can fire the Genesis torpedo at a moon, and it will remake the moon on a molecular level into something with, I don't know, soil, atmosphere, running water, I guess. No mention made of how on Earth the Genesis torpedo could give it an electromagnetic field, which it needs. If you don't have a stable and a strong electromagnetic field, you're not going to have any surface life. It's a magical MacGuffin of the type that Roddenberry loved, and there it is, right at the heart of this movie. And before we even get to the bad guys, Dr. McCoy has already seen what I imagine a lot of viewers saw the minute they had this thing described, which is that it's a recipe for a universal Armageddon. You can wipe out, the device will wipe out all existing life on a planet in favor of its new matrix. That's why in the movie we're told that the captain and crew of the Reliant have to be extra sure that the test planet they found has no life on it at all, not even a microbe. But Dr. McCoy is right. This is a fearful weapon of war. It doesn't matter that Carol Marcus and David Marcus are pie-eyed scientists who don't acknowledge that or don't care or think that it will always be in the right hands. And we don't hear anything more of it. We see it in Star Trek in Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, and then in Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, where the after effect of the Genesis bringing a planet to life, creating a planet out of a nebula, however that's supposed to work, how you get soil out of a nebula. That is the after effect of this device is used as the plot MacGuffin to bring Mr. Spock back to life. But after that, no. And in this book, which is part one of, I think, a 3-part series, John Vorholt gives us a next generation future of that idea. And I loved it. I don't think I ever read this. I loved it. We meet a very, very old Carol Marcus, 96, 97 years, almost a century has passed since the deployment of the Genesis device. She is retired, sequestered on a planet in the middle of nowhere. The Federation is embroiled in the Dominion War. They're not paying much attention to her, but she has a regular complement of Starfleet attendants who look a lot like guards. She is doing scientific work. In this case, on Pacifica, she is working on new and improved techniques for solar power, reclamation of solar power, a way maybe to make an entire beach into a solar collector. But she's tormented by the events of Star Trek II and Star Trek III. She's tormented by her development of this device and by the death of her son, which happens in Star Trek III. Rather unceremoniously, he's exited feet first, stage left by a random Klingon. One of the only examples of a random Klingon actually getting in a kill in Star Trek. These bloodthirsty warriors always seem to miss the mark, but not when it comes to Kirk's son. I've never forgiven them for the death of my boy. She is tormented by those memories, and we gradually learn what's going on here. We gradually learn that the Federation has quarantined not just Carol Marcus, who has a lot of the most important components of the Genesis effect in her head. No one has been able to completely break the process, which is kind of odd. I found that a little bit odd, since mention is made often of Genesis information in Starfleet databanks. In Star Trek II, Khan wants information from Genesis transferred to his vessel. He wants the device, but he wants the information as well. And when Kirk and crew are looking for Genesis on board the battered and seemingly defeated Enterprise, they're not looking for the device. They're looking for information. So it seems to me that the process is already out there. But in Vornhout's idea, not all of it is. And the Federation doesn't want it to be, obviously. If they're dealing with something like the Dominion or even the Romulans or whatnot, they don't want anybody to have access to this information. They don't. Dr. McCoy was right. It is an incredibly deadly device. And you can guess what's coming in this first volume. Carol Marcus is abducted by someone who very much wants to trick her into revealing the workings of the Genesis device, and it looks like they've succeeded because it starts to happen. The Genesis wave overtakes a peaceful planet and very nearly kills a character that we know a little from the Next Generation. Not a member of the crew, but Dr. Leia Brahms, a hologram of whom Geordi LaForge briefly fell in love with. And there's a really good follow-up to that in Next Generation where they have that out. What kind of a violation that would be? Exactly the kind of thing. I'm sure that I mocked that episode, the follow-up episode. I'm sure that I did, as exactly the kind of mawkish, talky episode that the Next Generation went in for ad infinitum. But looking back at it, it's extremely well done. It's like most of what the Next Generation does. When it thinks about a topic, it doesn't insult the intelligence of the reader, of the viewer. Leia Brahms shows up in here. There's a neat little thing. She's working on a prototypical spacesuit that one person can wear that phases them mildly out of the space-time continuum. They're still there. They're still visible. They can still conduct subspace communication, but they're a lot less vulnerable to the environment. because it's meant as an environmental exploration tool. She's in this suit when the Genesis wave sweeps over the planet. And that's the only reason she's able to survive. And soon enough, Captain Picard and the crew of the Enterprise learn that this is a danger that is now loose on the galaxy again. They have some wonderful scenes where they are taking stock of what the Genesis process was. And in those scenes, we get some really neat through the keyhole looks at the events of Star Trek II and Star Trek III that are very interesting and that raise a lot of problems. They very intelligently raise a lot of problems. Specifically about my beloved Star Trek III, which I've seen more often than I have seen any other movie of any kind. Not just any other Star Trek movie, but any movie of any kind. I've seen Star Trek III from start to finish many, 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 many times. And I love it. I absolutely love it. But I am the first person to admit all the weirdness of it. How do you make a planet from a nebula directly without millions of years? And also, even if you do make a planet from a nebula, why are there giant slugs? Yes, it makes for a cool moment where Christopher Lloyd's Klingon commander gets to kill one of them, but why are they there at all? Why are there giant slugs there at all? You might say hyper-accelerated evolution or hyper-accelerated growth, certainly hyper-accelerated growth or biological development of some kind, is what you would need for Spock's regeneration. But Spock was jettisoned to the Genesis planet as a resting place. Why? I have no idea. He has parents back on Vulcan. They might want the body, but he's jettisoned there. He's introduced into that biosphere. There's nothing else that's alive there. This is a planet that was coalesced from a nebula. There are no organic molecules there, but there are giant slugs, and it's a nightmare world. It's breaking up. It's unstable. Nothing is much done with that. In the movies, nothing is much done with that. The Genesis planet is not stable. Are all Genesis planets not stable? Did Dr. Marcus and her son ever notice a penchant for instability? And what does that mean? What does the instability mean? All of that is dealt with here in this book. And I really, really enjoyed it. I still don't quite know what to make with some of the Next Generation characters, especially Deanna Troi. I think that the version of Deanna Troi that I have been waiting for to make sense is the one I got in the third season of Star Trek Picard. If that Deanna Troi had been in the show all along, I might have made better sense of her. But in the show itself, maybe to have a ship's counselor, but to have a ship's counselor on the bridge, sitting next to the captain, is insane. That is just insane. And her role was always nebulous to me. It still is, even with a systematic revisit of the Next Generation, which I've been doing for years now. It's still nebulous to me. In the original show, McCoy is an expert in space psychology, as well as a gentle country doctor. Now the Enterprise, with a lot more people, has a counselor and a chief medical officer. Anyway, I never really got a handle, except for the third season of Star Trek Picard. I never really got a handle on Deanna Troi, and I don't get her in this book at all. I'm no expert yet on characterizations of original crew of Next Generation crew members that ring true. Some of them I get better than others. I think the easiest character on the Next Generation to misunderstand is actually Will Riker, and the easiest one to do is Worf, I think. But even so, even though my grasp of these things is a little bit rockier than it is with, for instance, the original series or my beloved Voyager, I don't think Deanna Troi is done well in this book. She's not in it that much, so it's not a detraction at all. I really, really enjoyed this. This is pretty much, to my mind, a perfect demonstration of how you write a Next Generation story, whether it's for the screen or for the page, where the Next Generation crew is dealing with something from, I almost said the real Star Trek, old reflexes die hard, from the original series, or the original series movies. I've seen a lot of examples where that's not done well, and this is a really good example of how to do it, I think. I don't know if the whole thing carries through. If I've never read book one, then I've certainly never read book two or book three. I'll have to get to them. Maybe I will for BookTrek and see. I'm certainly curious now. This ends with nothing resolved at all. So I at least want to go on to the next book. Maybe I'll do that tonight and see if it holds up. As I'm not sure that all three of them are written by John Vornholt, who I'm kind of sort of liking as a Star Trek writer. I also don't know if the Genesis Wave books were collected in one volume. I should look and see if they are collected in one volume. This is really interesting. So that is my BookTrek for today. Is Genesis Wave Book 1, which opens with reviving an idea from the great Star Trek movies, that's a great idea, and it's done really well here. And Vornholt asks lots of questions about the Genesis process that I never even thought to ask. So anyway, that is my BookTrek for today. I will wrap this up for now, and I will be back next time. Thank you, BookTube.